If you're a Mexican-American millennial, there's a good chance that you've seen Gregory Nava's 1997 film adaptation of Selena's life, which stars Jennifer Lopez as Selena and Edward James Olmos as her father, Abraham Quintanilla Jr. I have memories of watching this movie as a kid, but just as I have done with most of my childhood memories, I've shoved any recollection of this biopic into the deep recesses of my mind. Well, kind of. Even decades after seeing this movie for the first time, there's one specific scene that I think about almost regularly, and considering Abraham Quintanilla's enduring public image as a hard ass, I'm sure I'm not the only one. In this infamous scene, about 1 hour and 15 minutes into the movie, Abraham Quintanilla gets wise to the relationship that's been developing between his 20-year-old daughter and Los Dinos bad boy guitarist Chris Perez. Abraham, who has been driving the tour bus, catches a glimpse of Selena and Chris sitting beside each other and playing cards. A few seconds later, he looks back and finds that the two were embracing. Annoyed, Abraham pulls the bus over and tells everyone to exit except for direct family members and Chris. Abraham reprimands Selena and Chris and tells them that this, meaning any sort of closeness that could develop into romance, is over. Selena stands her ground, telling her father that he can't have control over who she can and can't see. She then opens up about her feelings toward Chris and says that they love each other and that they want to get married, and that's when everything goes downhill. Abraham fires Chris, but right before he does so, he barks out this line. "Now listen to me. If you think I'm going to allow you to come in and mess up my family, ruin everything that we've worked for, you're wrong." After firing Chris, Abraham delivers a cruel ultimatum. Selena can follow Chris and be responsible for the disbandment of the Dinos, or she can stay on the bus and move forward with the musical legacy that she and her family have built. Selena is visibly hurt by this ultimatum. However, she chooses to stay behind with the band, and after the tour bus sets out on the road, she quietly weeps into her mother's lap. According to comments from Abraham Quintanilla in interviews he's given, this scene is an almost perfect play-by-play recreation of what happened in real life. While this scene can be frustrating and difficult to watch, I think it reveals very important details about Selena and about Abraham. Although Selena does eventually sneak out and elope with Chris, her refusal to leave the bus shows that she's not only devoted to the music, but also to her family. As for Abraham, this scene reveals his deepest fears, not only as a musician and a manager, but as a parent. For many, if not most people watching this scene, Abraham's reactions might seem out of proportion. Here, the film, albeit aided by true events, is giving us the classic trope of the overbearing, unreasonable old-world father who is trying to control his increasingly assimilated children. However, I think learning more about Abraham's youth and upbringing as a working-class second-generation Mexican-American from South Texas can provide both this scene and the real-life moment it's based on with some much-needed context. Understanding his background, I think, can provide us with a better insight into Abraham's fears as a manager and a parent, and help explain how these fears clash with Selena's desires and dreams as a third-generation Mexican-American woman. If you're familiar with Gregory Nava's film, you may recall two famous scenes which are meant to give us context regarding the racial tensions of Abraham's youth. However, for me, these two clips aren't quite enough to explain why Abraham is such a hard ass, as they barely skim the surface as to the reasons for many of Abraham's actions. These actions include his refusal to let Selena sing in English at the beginning of her and Los Dinos' career, his overprotective behavior, and his constant reminder to his children that they have to be X amount of times as good as their white peers if they want to succeed in the United States.
Why was Selena important to you?
Well, because she represented us Mexican women, that we've always been put down, and she was on top of everything, on top of a lot of other people.
Since the tragic passing of his daughter, Abraham Quintanilla has become a polarizing subject within the community of Selena fans. It's not difficult to find tweets and comments in online circles that chastise Abraham, who they see as an opportunistic stage parent. Criticisms of the Quintanillas re-escalated as recently as 2019 when it was announced that there would be a new Quintanilla-sanctioned television series, with many people, myself included, collectively sighing, "Let Selena rest." While it's tempting to place Abraham in the same category of stage parents as Murray Wilson, Joe Jackson, or even Jamie Spears, this, I think, would be an unfair categorization. There's definitely an argument to be made that the world could have done without a new retelling of Selena's story. And if you're cynical like I am, you might even suggest that this is just a cash grab. However, after poring over interviews of Abraham and learning more about the Quintanillas, I began to shed my cynicism. To me, Abraham's actions regarding Selena's legacy don't come from a place of greed, but rather from a desire to preserve the legacy that he and his family created together. Selena was the face and the voice, and her siblings and the rest of the Dinos band members were the engine. But Abraham, with his hard-won insights into the American music industry, possessed the blueprint for success.
I want my kids to go through life this way. I want them to stand up and say, "Here I am," and be an American, be part of society, this so-called great society.
Credit must be given where it's due, and Abraham Quintanilla Jr., without a doubt, deserves to be recognized as a 20th century Mexican-American icon. Through his perseverance and unwillingness to compromise, he forged a path in the South Texas music scene in the 1950s and 60s. Though Abraham's story is often overlooked, it was his experiences that shaped not only his own life, but that of Selena, and paved the way for her monumental success in the 80s and 90s. Contrary to his self-serious portrayal in Gregory Nava's 1997 biopic, Abraham, who was born to Abraham and Maria Quintanilla in a racially segregated Corpus Christi on February 20th, 1939, describes himself as his family's rebel child and black sheep. By the time he was a teenager, his parents had left the Catholic Church to become Jehovah's Witnesses, but Abraham had no interest in taking up religion. Jonik Potosky, author of Selena como la Flor, writes that Abraham was busy answering another calling, one that to him was far more illuminating and personally fulfilling. It was the sound of voices harmonizing, making a kind of music that struck him as the sweetest, smoothest, most soothing form of communication he'd ever heard. His entry into music was through the small singing group the Gumdrops, but the real change in his life occurred when he heard Bobby Lira, Seferino Perales, and Lupe Barrera, the original Dinos, sing. After word got to Abe that Lupe Barrera was leaving the band, Abe approached the two remaining members and offered his singing services to the group. The two members agreed, and the three teens began to meet up after school for practice. Word of the Dinos' silky harmonies spread fast at their high school, Ray Miller High, and they were soon sought out to perform at parties and dances. At first, these gigs were just a fun, unpaid hobby, but after one graduation party where the host's father paid the Dinos $30 for performing, Abraham decided that they'd never play for free again. Putting a price on their gigs concerned Bobby and Sefe. What if people didn't want to pay them? What if they asked to be paid and people decided to never hire them again? Abraham, meanwhile, didn't have to think twice and was not going to let what he saw as a lucrative venture slip through his hands. If Bobby and Sefe wanted to sing for fun, that was all well and good, but Abraham was determined to get paid. Abraham's confidence in their abilities must have rubbed off on Bobby and Sefe, as they would soon begin to suggest that they charge $50 per gig instead of the original $30. On top of doing something he loved, Abraham was now making money doing it too. He saw that singing could pave a way to success and middle-class comforts faster than school and education could, and soon Abraham would drop out of Ray Miller High to pursue music full-time. The musical backdrop of the Texas that Abraham grew up in was a unique patchwork of distinct scenes and styles. Throughout the early 1900s, Mexican Americans in the South Texas region had been cultivating a sound that was very much their own. Conjunto music, which sonically borrows from Mexican norteño, as well as German, Polish, and Central European musical traditions, particularly polkas and waltzes, dominated South Texas in the early half of the 20th century. Conjunto, a Spanish word which literally translates to group, is first and foremost a working-class genre of music and can be identified by its use of accordion for rhythm and lead, and bajo sexto, a kind of guitar built with a deeper body and with 12 strings in 6 double courses used as a bass instrument. While conjunto was the music of South Texas working-class Mexican Americans, those Mexican Americans who were assimilating and making their way into the American middle class wanted to emulate the more sophisticated American big bands of the 1950s. Orquestas, as they were called, were big piece orchestras full of brass and class, but still retained some of their working-class Tex-Mex roots. Before continuing, I want to clarify the definition of the word Tejano, even though I don't use it too often in this essay. Tejano is one of those words that carries multiple meanings, and knowing these multiple meanings will give us a better understanding of this specific musical landscape. Tejano is used as a word to define people of Mexican ancestry who were born and raised in Texas. All Tejanos are Mexican American, but not all Mexican Americans have the privilege of being Tejanos. For example, Abraham Q and I are both Mexican Americans, but he is a Tejano and I am not. Música Tejana is an all-inclusive term used to define multiple styles that existed in the Tex-Mex, or the Tejano community, since the 19th century. This can include anything from corridos, rancheras, pop, orquesta, rock and roll, just as long as it's coming from a Tejano. For example, the Tex-Mex rock and roll music of Freddie Fender is música tejana. Tejano, as a loan term, has existed in pop culture since around the 80s to describe a specific genre that has its roots in conjunto accordion-based music, which has been modernized or updated to incorporate more instruments, including synthesizers and electric guitars, and which has also been updated to incorporate elements of US American pop and rock and roll. For example, Selena y los Dinos music is música tejana because of her background, and it can also be described by the lone tejano term because the foundation of her music is for the most part conjunto, but it incorporates synthesizers and borrows from pop and rock. For a more detailed and academic dive into música tejana, please read Tejano Proud, Tex-Mex Music in the 20th Century by Guadalupe San Miguel Jr. Like other young Americans across the country, young Mexican Americans were not immune to the influence of American pop, which included the burgeoning rock and roll scene and vocalist doo-wop sensations. The Dinos were obviously influenced by vocalists like Dion, and their harmonies had similarities to the trios románticos of Mexico. However, by recruiting a roster of musicians that could play brass, electric guitar, and organ, it was clear that they sought to emulate a more American big band, pop-adjacent sound rather than lean into their own Tex-Mex roots. It could be argued that Abraham must have seen music as a quick way to escape those roots in both a symbolic and a material way. As Joe Nick Petoskey writes, "Before the Dinos, Abe was just another pachuco in a gabacho world, trying to get by as best he could. His voice put him in the spotlight. He was the center of attention, which gave him a feeling of importance and worth. he'd never felt before. During the 1950s, the best way to get an audience's attention outside of playing live was the radio. While it wasn't easy for Mexican-American artists to get airplay thanks to radio program directors not wanting to play what they called Spanish music, the Dinos and other Tex-Mex bands were about to catch a lucky break in the form of a radio DJ named Charlie Bright. Charlie Bright, a radio DJ for Top 40 AM radio station KEYS, kept his hand on the pulse of what kids wanted to hear by hosting sock hops at schools throughout Corpus Christi. With Corpus Christi having a sizable number of Mexican-American teens, it was no surprise that a good number of songs requested by them were songs by other Mexican-American teens. In spite of the discouraging and discriminatory remarks made by his program director, Charlie Bright would sneak in Tex-Mex rock and roll late at night after the program director had long gone to bed. This proved to be a success as, upon playing these songs, the phone lines started lighting up like never before. Once Bright became a program director himself, he filled the airwaves with music he knew would keep the phones lit, and he additionally began to aggressively promote live shows featuring bigger Mexican-American regional bands like Sonny and the Sunliners and Little Joe and the Latinaires.
Tell me, dear, tell me you love me so. You say goodbye, whoa, yes, Ramona.
Unsurprisingly, all this promotion of Mexican-American rock and roll groups prompted some angry white listeners to call in and complain,
"If you're gonna play that Mexican music, I ain't gonna listen."
But these listener complaints didn't matter. Charlie Bright and Jungle Jim West, another KEYS DJ and station manager, knew what most people wanted to hear, and there would be no stopping them. Eventually, Charlie Bright and the Dinos would cross paths after Bright opened up an 8-track recording studio in downtown Corpus Christi. Charlie Bright heard the trio sing and took a chance on them, leading the Dinos to record their first single, So Hard to Tell, which was released through Johnny Herrera's J.W. Fox label. Charlie Bright and Jungle Jim West did everything they could to promote the Dinos, making sure that the single was played during both their radio shifts. Eventually, the Dinos recorded their second single, Won't You Give Me a Chance. This single not only got them airplay on the local stations, but also on KILT, Houston's Top 40 radio station. While they enjoyed success on the radio, playing live gigs came with its hiccups. The two most famous touring incidents were portrayed in the Gregory Nava biopic rather faithfully. In one, a club owner in the North Beach part of Corpus Christi found out that the Dinos were a group of Mexican-American teens and not Italian, and so he paid them to not show up. In another incident, the Dinos were hired to play in Sinton, Texas, to Mexican farm workers who were likely expecting to hear norteño or conjunto. When the Dinos showed up singing doo-wop and American-style music, they were booed off the stage rather violently. Petoskey writes, "The Dinos were all Mexican-Americans. The music they sang was in English. Neither were acceptable to the crowd that had paid money at the door." Abraham recalls these events. "We didn't know any Mexican music, and we were just singing doo-wop. Pretty soon, the whole dance was in an uprising over it. They closed the dance and refunded the money." That was putting it mildly. The crowd ran the band off stage and out the building. Sheriff's deputies had to be called in to escort the Dinos out of town. It was a sobering lesson. In Tejano Proud, Tex-Mex Music in the 20th Century, Guadalupe San Miguel Jr. references the distaste for traditional Mexican music that was common among the generation of young Mexican-American musicians like Abraham and Sonny Ozuna. Sonny Ozuna, as well as many members of his generation, dismissed or rejected Mexican music in general and conjunto music in particular. The failure to embrace this music was based in some respects on its negative associations and on its perceived irrelevance. The youth viewed Mexican music as part of their parents' cultural heritage, not theirs. For this reason, many young Tejano musicians viewed Mexican music as old-fashioned or else as irrelevant to their lives in the United States. Abraham and the Dinos, like many Mexican-American bands of their generation, were learning hard lessons about the difficulty of treading the line between assimilation and staying in touch with your roots. And the message that many of these bands would eventually take from these situations is that they were looking in the wrong direction for success. Other South Texan acts, similar to the Dinos, Mexican in heritage and US American by birth, were finding some success by foregoing English lyrics altogether and playing pop, rock, and R&B songs in Spanish to a Spanish-speaking audience. No quiero más que tu amor, lo sabes tú muy bien que soy de ti. However, in the long run, the language barrier and to some extent the generational music gap would limit their audience to small pockets of Mexican-American teens. One of the more successful Mexican-American rock and roll acts, Sonny and the Sunglows, had managed to get onto Dick Clark's American Bandstand with their English-language hit, Talk to Me. But rather than continue assimilating into American pop music, they made a sharp career turn and released a song titled Cariño Nuevo, a Spanish-sung conjunto-flavored ballad that catered more to the audience they regularly saw at live gigs rather than the audience they'd played for on American Bandstand.
Estoy unido a ti, como el calor al fuego.
Despite Sonny's success in the English-speaking musical mainstream, in 1964 he began to record in Spanish. Continued discrimination in the English-language market and increased community pressures for Spanish music, and the need to try new things encouraged Sonny to switch to Spanish-language tunes. Because of his popularity and tremendous success, when Sonny switched to Spanish-language music in 1964, it brought a halt to the fledgling Tejano English-language recording industry, and initiated a trend toward the development of a new sound in Tejano music, the modern Orquesta Tejana. It was a tough world for these young musicians. The reality was that Mexican-American musicians wouldn't achieve success through assimilation. No matter how talented a Mexican-American musician could be, the deeply entrenched racism and prejudices against anyone who wasn't white in the entertainment industry would make breaking into the mainstream, let alone continued success, extremely difficult, if not nearly impossible. The Dinos' story paralleled that of Sonny's. Johnny Herrera, a fellow South Texan music veteran turned teacher and record store owner, urged the Dinos to stop singing in English and tailor their sound and lyrics to court a wider Spanish-speaking audience. Johnny Herrera, who was 9 years older than Abraham, had experiences in the music business that would serve Abraham and eventually Selena well. Like many of his contemporaries, he saw traditional Mexican music as something to distance himself from, seeing it as outdated and irrelevant to his experiences as a Mexican American. Instead, he was fascinated by big bands and popular American singers, specifically Frank Sinatra. However, after a family trip to Monterrey, Nuevo León, he gained an appreciation for his Mexican background. In 1949, at age 19, he recorded a song titled De Rodillas Vendrás, and it not only received extensive play throughout the valley, but it also got the attention of artists on both sides of the border. In Texas, it was Carmen y Laura, backed by Beto Villa's orquesta, who covered the song, and in Mexico, it was actress and singer Maria Victoria. In that same year, Herrera would continue having success by covering the country music standard Jealous Heart and converting it to the Spanish-language hit Corazón Celoso. Just like Abraham, Herrera encountered discrimination from both Mexicans and white Americans. Herrera reconciled Mexican working-class conjunto with the big band-influenced orquesta to make a new sound that would gain him popularity on both sides of the border, but he was shown that he couldn't escape the heavily racialized and ethnically divided world he lived in. While he was used to white Americans disparaging him because of his Mexican background, he would come to realize that Mexicans weren't much different. He was no stranger to racism in Texas, where he was called pepperbelly or worse. On the other side of the Rio Grande, Herrera discovered prejudice of an entirely different kind. Mexicans, he learned, were just as bad as Anglos. At the offices of RCA Records in Mexico City, an executive asked him, "What are you?" "Mexicano," Herrera replied. "What part of Mexico are you from?" Herrera replied he was from Texas. No. Then you're a Norteamericano." Herrera satisfied his inquisitor by telling him that, in that case, he was Tejano, a Mexicano from Texas. Rather than feel denied a part of his identity, this encounter with the record executive made Herrera lean harder into his unique identity as a Tejano. Johnny Herrera bluntly let the Dinos know that there was very little chance of them breaking into the mainstream American market. Despite his stubborn nature, Abraham surrendered and decided that it was time to make the switch to Spanish. In 1964, the Dinos recorded the Johnny Herrera original Con Esta Copa. This recording became an instant hit, getting major airplay on Spanish program radio stations from Texas to California and even all the way up to Chicago. There was no turning back for the Dinos, and from then on, they became Los Dinos. Los Dinos and their ambitions soon outgrew Johnny Herrera's small label, through which they released Con Esta Copa, and so Herrera pointed them to Arnaldo Ramirez Falcón Records, which had a larger distribution range. Los Dinos would record 3 albums under Falcón Records before moving over to Bernal Records, the other big league Tex-Mex record label. Throughout the late 60s, Los Dinos would display their versatility and their dual appeal as musicians caught in the middle of 2 distinct cultures. The strength of their harmonies, their understanding of orquesta and subsequent absorption of brass instruments, and their handle on American R&B and soul could have catapulted them to stardom. However, the choice to sing in Spanish, which did succeed in garnering them a solid following that guaranteed them ticket sales and a steady income, nonetheless also meant cutting themselves off from crossing into the American mainstream. No matter where the band went, there were always reminders of intolerance, the prejudice that whites and browns were separate and not equal. Sometimes it was merely the look on someone's face. Sometimes it was more obvious, like the signs posted in cafes, swimming pools, and skating rinks, outside restrooms and water fountains all over South and West Texas. No Mexicans allowed. No matter how talented they were and how sweet their 4-part harmonies sounded, the race and culture they sang to would forever limit their appeal. Perception was 3/4 of the problem. Mexicanos in Texas came from peon stock, and Anglos constantly reminded them of it. By the end of the 60s, Abraham was approaching his 30s, and ticket sales for shows were dwindling. After having missed the birth of his first 2 children, Abraham III and Suzette, the consequences of being a family man constantly on the road had begun to sink in. It didn't matter how much time and effort he had put into his dream of making a living through music. He had 2 young kids and a wife to look after, and the touring life was just not feasible. As stubborn as Abraham was, he knew it was time, yet again, to be practical. Abraham left his spot in Los Dinos and moved his family out to Corpus Christi for a job as a shipping clerk and tow operator at the Dow chemical plant in Lake Jackson, Texas. The steady income at Dow allowed Abe to raise AB, Suzette, and their new baby girl, Selena, in relative comfort. That said, although Abe may have settled down to raise a family, the people close to him knew that his passion for music had never really left. After work, Abe would blow off steam by strumming his guitar, and much to his surprise, his children began to show interest in music. According to Selena, her main motivation to learn words to songs was sibling rivalry, as she had noticed her dad had begun teaching young AB how to play an old Sears Roebuck bass guitar. I guess I got a little jealous, so I went out and got this musical book that my dad had with old songs, and I started making my own melody and singing in front of them, hoping he would notice me, and my dad started teaching me, and I guess he noticed that I picked up right away, and my timing was there. You know, I knew when to come in and when to go out and all that. And soon enough, after some infamously considerable effort put into convincing Suzette to pick up the drums, the Quintanillas had their own little band. In Abraham Quintanilla's autobiography, A Father's Dream, he writes, "That old music wheel started turning again, not for Selena or any of my children to be music artists. I just felt proud that my daughter could do what I like to do. There's pride in knowing that your child has a talent for something you love." With AB on bass, Suzette on drums, me on guitar, and Selena singing, we had an excellent little band going. The young band members were ready to learn and get more involved in music. My dream had always been music, and it became their dream too. In the summer of 1980, Abraham and his friend Santos Jim Serna Jr. opened up a restaurant called Papagayos. Neither Jim nor Abraham had any experience in the restaurant industry, but they remained confident that this venture would provide them with a stable income while being their own boss. 1 month later, Abraham quit his job at the Dow chemical plant. While the restaurant would serve as a place to showcase Southern Pearl, the name of the family band at the time, as well as other live entertainment, it was evident that the logistics of running this business were too much for Abraham and Jim to handle. Not only were the two men inexperienced at running a restaurant, but the US was heading into a recession. By March of 1981, Papagayos had closed its doors for good, leaving the Quintanillas almost penniless. They had used up all their savings in establishing the restaurant, and they were beginning to fall behind on their mortgage payments. Fortunately, they were able to sell their house before the bank foreclosed on them, but their finances were shot. The loss of Papagayos and their home was a huge blow to Abraham's pride. Abraham and his family were now crashing with relatives in Corpus Christi while trying to figure out their next move. In the meantime, Abe picked up odd jobs here and there, and even applied to other chemical plants around the area. However, he was rejected for being overqualified, a nicer and more professional way of saying too old. Abraham became convinced that the only way to make it out of this financial pit was music. Selena would recall this period of their lives in interviews as an adult. "We started playing at a restaurant that my dad owned, and eventually we started playing for, weddings and family affairs that my dad kind of forced us on him, and it all happened from there. We went through a hard time, and we had to turn to music as a means of putting food on the table, and we've been doing it ever since." Fast forward 11 years, and there's Selena on the bus, her career as a singer just starting to take off, crying into her mother's lap with Abraham behind the wheel. In my opinion, a lot of the criticism aimed at Abraham Quintanilla, and to an extent the entire Quintanilla family, can be attributed to two things. One, rather than centering their story around Mexican-American familial bonds and community, the family's choice to approve of dramatic retellings that emphasize a Selena-centered narrative has made it easy for a cynical audience to read their story through the lens of US-American individualism. And this has had the unintended consequence of casting the rest of the family as villains. And two, the lengths to which Yolanda Saldivar's defense team went to paint Abraham as a manipulative villain, while Saldivar was on trial for Selena's murder. In December 2020, Selena the series premiered on Netflix to mixed reviews. Critics were quick to point out that not only was Selena reduced to a flat caricature that resembled a Disney princess, but that the series pulled a bait and switch on them. Critics and fans alike were upset that the series went out of its way to focus on Abraham and the rest of the family, and left Selena playing a supporting role in a series that bears her name. In her review of the second season of Selena the series, Marisa de la Cerda writes, "With the late singer's father Abraham Quintanilla and sisters Suzette Quintanilla serving as executive producers, the first half of the series dug deep into the lives of the different family members as Selena y los Dinos rose to stardom, and it wasn't until the last few episodes that it began to focus on the singer herself. Part 2 of Selena the series picks up where Part 1 left off, and attempts to give viewers a closer look at her experiences and conflicted feelings as she became more famous and got closer to recording her first English album. While the singer does get more of a spotlight in part 2, she's still singing back up to the rest of her siblings in what remains more of a family drama than a revealing biopic series. Since Selena's death, the Quintanillas have made a continuous effort to keep her legacy alive, and for the most part, have centered their story around Selena the individual. This decision certainly makes sense. Selena was, after all, the face and the voice. She was the one sought by adoring crowds, and it was her voice that won all those Tejano music awards. However, the family's choice to continue to tell their story around Selena the individual, as opposed to embracing the larger narrative of community and the Mexican-American family unit, has unwittingly played a role in allowing their efforts as a family to be cast aside. One could argue that the most recent Netflix series attempts to correct this narrative by giving extensive screen time to other members of the Quintanilla family. However, in my opinion, the fact that the Quintanilla family waited so long to spotlight other members, and their insistence on still naming the series after Selena rather than something evoking the family and/or the band, possibly worked against them. Audiences have a right to be dissatisfied with a series that claims to have new insights into the singer's life, only to have the series seemingly pull a bait and switch, where the main characters turn out to be the rest of the family. Had the Quintanillas opted to make a series centering themselves as a family unit as opposed to Selena the lone star much sooner, there may have been less of a backlash to this kind of framing. Or maybe not. It's possible that many Selena fans would have always seen the rest of the family as nothing but opportunistic, for a reason I'll get to in a minute, and a narrative centering the family rather than Selena alone may have always risked a backlash. I can also understand the thought process behind the Quintanillas' original choice to center the narrative, both throughout the 1997 film and in the naming of the 2020 series around Selena. In a way, that has always been an obvious choice, not only because Selena was the star, but also because there's nothing that US Americans love more than a story of an individual succeeding alone against all odds. The fact that the United States fosters an individualist ethos isn't one that needs much explaining. A reverence for the myth of the lone cowboy or the rogue trailblazer who answers to no one is practically hardwired into our personalities starting from the moment we're old enough to consume popular media. This type of individualism seeps into everything in our daily lives, from our healthcare and education policies to the way we casually talk about the most disenfranchised people in society. Everything begins and ends with the individual, and it's no surprise that we love telling and retelling stories through this lens, including complex stories like that of the third-generation Mexican-American singer Selena and her father, a second-generation Mexican-American singer and musician. In the individual framed narrative of Selena's story, there's very little room to talk about the generational and cultural push and pull between parent and child. There's very little room to talk about the nuances of assimilation, or themes of culture shock, alienation, loss of identity, the myth of the American dream, and the reverence to and rejection of the family unit within the context of Mexican-American families. Whether you're a first-generation Mexican-American who happened to go through a very thorough process of assimilation, like I am, or if you're a regular old white born and bred US American, it might be easy to take a superficial reading of Selena's story. You might see her story as one of Selena the individual against the world. You might believe that it was always Selena against her father's wishes, Selena alone against the mainstream American market, Selena alone against the patriarchy and machismo of the Tejano music scene, etc. You might even react to anecdotes involving Abraham by saying,
"What the hell? She's just trying to sing a Donna Summer song, and you're not letting her. What is your damage, old man?"
Criticisms of Selena the series would also have you believe that Abraham wasn't a trailblazer or accomplished on his own, but rather a controlling has-been leeching off his children's success. Judy Berman of Time magazine criticizes the framing of the latest Selena series by saying that in this series, it's Abraham who propels the family, though without veering into abusive Joe Jackson territory. Instead, he's an archetypal immigrant dad, tough on his kids because he wants them to thrive, and at the same time, a frustrated musician, projecting his own ambitions onto the next generation. These types of criticisms, stacked alongside an individualistic reading of Selena's story and Abraham's cemented reputation as a hard-ass, thanks to scenes like the one from Gregory Nava's film, make it difficult to see Abraham in a sympathetic light. When I was younger and I watched Nava's film for the first time, I projected my own difficult relationship with my father onto their story. My own judgments and relationships clouded my interpretation of what I was seeing, and so I had a hard time understanding why Abraham was so hell-bent on keeping Selena from singing in English, and even more trouble understanding why Abraham was so upset at seeing his 20-year-old daughter develop a relationship with their guitarist. However, as an adult, after having spent a significant time away from my own family, having a deeper knowledge of Abraham's experiences as a young working musician, and having a better understanding of the history of Tejano music, it's difficult for me to cast Abraham as a villain. While fans and critics' frustration in seeing Abraham continue to insert himself into Selena's story is somewhat understandable, choosing to frame Abraham's time spent as a musician in the 50s and 60s as merely incidental and characterizing him as a frustrated musician is misleading and dishonest. Criticisms like Judy Berman's forget that Selena's story and success doesn't exist in a vacuum. It was Abraham's experience as a young musician in tandem with efforts put forward by the entire Quintanilla family and the support of the Tejano community as Selena was beginning her career that helped Selena become an international phenomenon.
And of course, I'd like to thank all the public who have, doing that, for supporting Selena's Dinos, and I also like to thank all the fans in Mexico for giving us such a wonderful reception. También Bardos del Valle. And of course, last but not least, I'd like to thank my family, my parents. I love you so much, and I thank you from the bottom of my heart for giving me the talent and that we all have. AB and my sister, and of course AB for writing the songs, thank you. And I'd like to thank my husband. I love you.
Upon closer inspection, while Abraham's actions may be seen as tough and perhaps unnecessary, they aren't entirely unreasonable. Abe's decision to have Selena y los Dinos sing in Spanish and perform Tejano music was the most logical choice based on his experiences. All of Abraham's contacts were wrapped up in the Tejano music scene of the 60s. And thanks to this, Abe's kids wouldn't have to start their music career from scratch. Abe knew who the promoters were, he knew how to haggle, he knew where to book gigs, and most importantly, he knew the worth of his own children. Abraham didn't discourage Selena from singing in English or covering US American pop songs because he was old-fashioned or wanted to hold her back and restrict her to the Spanish-speaking world. But it was because Abraham had been taught the value of connecting musically to his community by Johnny Herrera. Johnny Herrera taught Abraham about the power and strength of their comunidad. Herrera knew that at the end of the day, no one would have a Tejano's back like other Tejanos. Could a Tejano artist eventually make it into the white American pop mainstream? Could a Tejano artist eventually hear their songs on the top 40 radio stations? Of course, but not without the comunidad cheering them on. And if they tried, and they didn't make it, well, at least they'd always have the adoring crowds at the dance halls. Both Johnny and Abraham knew that their lifeboats were their communities and their families, and this knowledge was passed on to Abraham's kids. The reality that musicians like Abraham, Johnny Herrera, and Sonny Ozuna lived through was that only your skin color and your background could speak for you, and not your talent. Abraham didn't want his children to learn the way he did, so he correctly advised them to woo Tejanos and Mexicanos before trying to cross over. In Maria Garcia's 2021 podcast, Anything for Selena, she had the privilege of interviewing Abraham Quintanilla. This interview is enlightening, and it gives us an insight into the differences and similarities between Abraham and his daughter Selena. Abraham makes it very clear that one of the biggest differences between him and his daughter is their approach to people who are outside of the family. Selena was very open and welcoming to strangers, fans, journalists, photographers, and other outsiders. Even when people crossed her, she never closed doors and always left an opportunity to make amends. Abraham, on the other hand, very openly admits that he only trusts God and people in his immediate family. Regarding the infamous bus scene in Gregory Nava's movie, in addition to admitting that it's essentially accurate, Abraham describes his reluctance to accept a relationship between his daughter and their guitarist Chris Bettis. "Well, I didn't know him that well. I've never liked a man with long hair. I think long hair is for women. What if this guy here marries my daughter? And he's one of these Mexican guys who think they're machos. And smaller men are like that. He marries my daughter and says, 'You're not gonna sing anymore.' And all the work that we've done as a family since they were little kids would go down the tube." The fear that someone will come along and steal the light and joy from your child is easy to understand. While Abraham's reactions may have been drastic and possibly out of line, his fears were not unfounded. The other key outsider that plays a major role in the story of Selena and Abraham is Yolanda Saldivar. In 1991, Yolanda Saldivar met Abraham and Suzette Quintanilla and convinced them to let her run a Selena fan club. This would entail collecting money from fans in exchange for Selena fan club membership cards and merchandise. In 1993, Saldivar would quit her nursing job and move to Corpus Christi to be closer to Selena. As the Selena empire grew throughout the early 90s, so did Yolanda's responsibilities. She quickly went from being a fan club president to being in charge of the Selena Etc. boutiques, which opened in 1994. While it's now known that Yolanda Saldivar had a history of debt and embezzlement, the Quintanillas had no prior knowledge of this. Saldivar had been sued by one of her previous employers, dermatologist Dr. Faustino Gomez, for stealing $9,200 in 1983. Then in 1991, Saldivar was once again in court for failing to repay a student loan of $5,361. Rumors about Yolanda stealing from the Quintanillas had been floating around even before Selena's murder. Both Selena's fashion designer Martin Gomez and Selena's cousin Debra Ramirez had warned both Selena and Abraham that Yolanda couldn't be trusted. By January 1995, the Quintanillas began receiving angry letters from fans and parents saying that their merchandise packages had never arrived in the mail. According to Abraham, Saldivar tried to claim that these were just scams from people who wanted to get free merchandise. After further inspection, Abraham, Suzette, and Selena uncovered a paper trail that indicated Yolanda had been stealing thousands of dollars from the Quintanillas. Saldivar was confronted with the reality that she would have to face consequences for her actions. She would no longer be able to ride on the coattails of Selena, and she could no longer enjoy the glamorous lifestyle that she'd become accustomed to. This was all too much for her to handle, and in an act of desperation, she lured and took Selena's life on March 31st, 1995. The all-encompassing media spectacle that ensued prior to Saldivar's trial bordered on the obscene, but it would be nothing compared to the tale Saldivar's defense attorneys would weave in an attempt to get her off the hook. Saldivar's defense team, composed of defense attorney Douglas Tinker and former county and district attorney Arnold Garcia, quickly got to work tugging at every thread to reframe Saldivar's actions as acts of self-defense. District Attorney Carlos Valdez and Chief Prosecutor Mark Skirka knew that Douglas Tinker was a formidable opponent who'd make them work to make their case. As Mark Skirka cynically noted, Doug's clients don't have accidents, they have terrible, tragic accidents. Abraham Quintanilla was soon subjected to Tinker's plans to manipulate the narrative. "He's trying to drag our family through the mud. He's fishing around. He doesn't have a case. He wants my tax papers. What does that have to do with her killing my daughter? He's requested criminal records. What criminal records? He's trying to harass me. I don't know what he's trying to do. I know this guy Tinker is trying to create an illusion. He's gonna try to smear us. He's gonna try to put the blame somewhere else. But at the end of the day, I know that justice will be served." Tinker worked hard, claiming that Abraham had not only threatened Saldivar, but also physically assaulted her in an attempt to break up the friendship between her and Selena. He had also painted Abraham as a fame-obsessed man who had yanked little Selena out of school and forced her to perform at nightclubs and bars for money. Ultimately, all of these claims were made null through Saldivar's own inconsistencies and inclination toward lying. As far as claims that Abraham had robbed Selena of basic education for the sake of money, as a teenager, Selena attained her high school diploma through the American School of Correspondence and was eventually accepted at Louisiana State University, but enrolled at Pacific Western University. While the jury ultimately delivered a guilty verdict against Saldivar, the defense team's wild accusations against Abraham, which painted a portrait of an egomaniac vicariously living through his 3 children, had been spoken into public consciousness. From this moment on, Abraham Quintanilla's image in the public eye would not be that of a father whose family was torn apart by an obsessed fan, but rather of a stage parent who had lost their meal ticket. Unfortunately, this is the image that many of Selena's fans have of Abraham. These beliefs have been reinforced throughout the years by news articles, social media comments from angry fans, and not to mention the infamous bus scene. It's easy to criticize Abraham when we see photos of a youthful and bubbly Selena contrasted with photographs of the older and stoic Abraham. Selena's star shines so bright that it eclipses the catalyst that launched her into the stratosphere of American icons, her family, and most importantly, Abraham's own journey as a musician. The story of Selena is not a story about a young, lone trailblazing woman who was held back by her old-fashioned father. As much as we, the US American public, love the myth of the lone figure, this just isn't that kind of story. Selena was never alone, and neither was Abraham for that matter. Abraham had his community of musicians and connections in the Tejano music industry, connections which he cultivated through years of touring and friendships. And Selena had her family, Abraham, Marcella, AB, and Suzette. To me, Abraham Quintanilla's determination to protect his daughter while she was alive didn't come from a place of authoritarian control, but from knowing the harsh realities of the entertainment industry. I would also argue that the family guarding Selena's image after her passing isn't something that stems out of greed, but rather is a defense mechanism to protect the legacy that they all built together as a family, and perhaps even as a way to compensate for the protection they ultimately couldn't give her while she was alive. Whatever your opinion of Abraham Quintanilla is, there is no denying that his experiences in the music industry in the 50s and 60s helped catapult Selena to fame. As a father, he saw his own passion for music reflected in his children, and it reignited his love for performing after having abandoned it upon accepting his responsibility as a family man. I'd like to put all the noise, all the salacious rumors, the tantalizing chismes, the tabloids, and Yolanda Saldivar to the side for a moment. To me, the story of the Quintanillas is a story about music running through the veins of a Mexican-American family, and it's a story about turning to your community for strength. Maria Garcia begins the second episode of her podcast, Anything for Selena, by talking about how nervous she is about meeting Abraham. Even after Abraham had agreed to meet up at a restaurant for an interview, and after she'd seen a different side of him, Abraham as an elderly man with a sunny disposition, she still mentions that she fears she'll encounter the Abraham from the Selena movie. During the interview, Abraham gives some fans a spontaneous tour of the Selena Museum, itself located in the studio Abraham built in Corpus Christi for his family band. The tour soon morphs into a quick Q&A, during which one fan immediately opens up and asks, "Why do you yell at her so much, Mr. Grumpo?" The small crowd of fans laugh. Abraham responds, "Have you ever seen me before?" The fan replies, "No, in the movie." "Do you know me?" Abraham asks. "No." "Then why do you say that?" The crowd laughs again. "'Cause you were so mean to her." Abraham replies, No. The fan, fighting laughter, replies, "Yes." "Now that is a movie." The fan interjects, "Especially on the RV." The crowd laughs again, and any tension that may have been floating in the air has totally subsided. "It's a movie." Abe can't hold his laughter in and continues, "And it wasn't even an RV, it was a bus." The entire room fills with laughter again. Number 1, that was the actor. That was not me. And that's why a lot of people see the movie and they think that I'm a bad guy. I'm mean, that I control my children, y que I do this, y que esto, y que el otro. It ain't like that, dear. I'm a father, a proud father that had the privilege of working with my kids since they were little. As they grew into adults, they became my friends. So don't believe the characters in the movie. Before closing out the video, I'd like to clarify a few things. I know I've talked a lot about the value of family within Selena's story, but I want to clarify that personally, I'm not here to promote or defend the family unit or family values, nor am I here to say that Mexican family values are better or worse than US American family values. I'm also certainly not here to chastise individuality. Please don't misinterpret what I'm saying. I am also aware that there are plenty of cases of child stars suffering abuse under their parents. Abusive entertainment families are not rare. However, from the information I've gathered, there's no evidence to prove that the Quintanillas were that type of family. The impression I came out with was that the Quintanillas are a rare type of family who achieved success through love and mutual support, both within their own family and their community. And because this dynamic is so rare to find within the celebrity sphere, and to some extent within the Mexican-American community, I think it's important to untangle and demystify their story. Also, I simply have a hard time believing that Abraham Quintanilla was as manipulative and controlling as everyone says he is. Even my earlier assertion that Abraham stopped Selena from covering American pop songs when she was younger is somewhat incorrect. There's footage of her performing Michael Jackson's Billie Jean at a show in Texas when she was fairly young. I would also like to clarify that I'm criticizing the way the Quintanillas have chosen to tell their story, because like many others, I've come to see the Quintanillas and Selena's story as an extension of my experience as a Mexican American. Seeing them flatten their story for a glossy feature-length film and a badly produced Netflix series makes me feel like the potential for a grand Mexican American epic has been squandered. I believe they're selling themselves short. However, I do have to admit that it's admirable how hard the Quintanillas have fought to have control over their own narrative and legacy. One last thing. As much as I dislike the new Selena series, I got even more annoyed reading criticisms of it because most critics regurgitate the same complaints, and furthermore, they trip over themselves to insult Abraham Quintanilla and the rest of the family. That being said, Texas Monthly's article, We Need to Talk About Selena, and Maria Elena Garcia's tweet thread from December 6, 2020, do a really great job at pinpointing the cultural details that were overlooked in the series for the sake of a tidy and easily consumable television series. I highly suggest reading them if you choose to watch the series. Thank you for watching. There's a lot more to say about Abraham and Selena, especially in regards to Chris Perez and his difficulties with the Quintanilla family, but I wanted this video to zone in on Abraham's early life, and I also wanted to dive into the South Texas music scene of the mid-20th century. This video is also pretty long, and I tried to be as succinct as possible, but if you think there's an important detail that I missed regarding Tejano music, chime in the comment section. All of my sources are listed in a document in the description, but I relied heavily on the following. Joe Nick Petoskey's 1996 biography on Selena titled Selena como la Flor. This is where I got most of my information regarding Abraham and Los Dinos and the trial. I also used Abraham's autobiography as a way to corroborate some of the information from Petoskey's 1996 book, and as well as a source for photographs. Any images of young Abe and the Quintanilla family obviously belong to Mr. Q, along with the video of Selena performing at the Miller Outdoor Theater in 1987. If you're left wanting to know more about the international phenomenon that was Selena Quintanilla, I highly recommend Maria Garcia's 2021 podcast, Anything for Selena. Maria uses Selena's story as a jumping off point to explain and tackle everything from the complicated concept of Latinidad to fatherhood, memes, and race. In addition to Anything for Selena, I also recommend Deborah Paredes' book Selenidad, Selena, Latinos, and the Performance of Memory. I also want to highlight the Arhuli Foundation's Frontera Collection and their YouTube channel, and UCLA's Strachwitz Frontera Collection. Thanks to their archival efforts, I was able to discover so much of the early Tejano music and information I presented in this video. It was really difficult to find the Dinos album of pop covers Sock To Ya, which includes a cover of Bretton Woods' Give Me a Sign and Smokey Robinson and the Miracles' I Second That Emotion, but UCLA's Strachwitz Frontera Collection came in handy and I was able to listen to this album. I really recommend you guys check it out. As far as books about Tejano music, I relied heavily on Guadalupe San Miguel Jr.'s Tejano Proud and John Dyer's Conjunto. Tejano Proud is a short book, but it's packed to the gills with really valuable information. Conjunto is filled with amazing portraits of the who's who of Tejano, and it includes essays by Jonik Butowski and Juan Tejada. Obviously, a lot of my visuals were from Gregory Nava's Selena and the Netflix series, but I also used clips from Les Blank's 1976 film, Chulas Fronteras, and the 1995 documentary, Songs of the Homeland. If you're interested in learning about Tejano music through a visual medium, I can't recommend Chulas Fronteras and Songs of the Homeland enough. I also relied on archival footage from the Kino library for this video. I can't thank archivists enough. From the folks in universities, to the Internet Archive and the Wayback Machine, to music collectors, to people like Marianne Stokes and your buddy who still clings on to their ripped VHS copy of Looney Tunes, complete with commercials from 2001. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe, and hit the bell to be notified of new video essays. I'd like to hear back from you guys. Has your perspective on the movie changed as you've gotten older? What about your perspective on Abraham Quintanilla? Let me know in the comments. Thanks again for watching. Till next time.